This is Sirens, a series brought to you by the Lady to Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues. Also, we will sometimes lure some men to their desks. And this is the week that I finally, after several episodes, many episodes, took the new series out of our intro. And I'm kind of excited by that. I'm Lauren DeYoung-Shulman.
I'm Radha Iyengar-Plum.
And if you have not said nice things about us, either on social media or on our reviews, and you're still listening, will you pretty please do that? There's some really nice reviews that people have left for us. There's also some really kind of psycho weird ones. And sometimes you have to do things to combat the psycho weird ones. So help us fight back against psycho weird people. And with that, have you noticed how men only have a really limited number of clothing items that they're allowed to be kind of weird about, socks? Or ties, I guess, too, but mostly socks or ties. And that makes me kind of sad for them. Surely there's other things that you could pick that you could be kind of weird about. So I wanted to ask, if you had to pick a clothing thing as a man, either among socks or ties or whatever else you would want them to be, what would you pick?
I have thought long and hard about this. I would bring back hats.
Oh, okay, awesome.
I feel that a dapper hat could really go, well, it just depends on, that would make it your thing, right? So you would have a hat for various occasions. If you were about on your daily business, you might have a bowler hat.
Yeah.
If you were going to a sporting event, you could go with the traditional baseball hats, but you could also adjust for the particular sporting event.
Yeah.
You could have big beach hats. I just feel like there's a lost era of hats. And then I would stand up and take off my hat at appropriate times.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hat related flourishes that you could add to your day-to-day existence if hats were reintroduced as a critical apparel piece.
So I ultimately did not decide. I'm going to mention a few things. One is I do really like pocket squares, and I actually feel like pocket squares have become more permissible. People, anyone can wear a pocket square, and it's not seen as a weird thing. When I was at my cousin's wedding about a few weeks ago, my dad was not the night of the wedding. That was a tux, white or a black tie event. But the night before, he was wearing a suit or was wearing a sports coat or something like that. And we were talking about pocket squares. And I demonstrated how you can pull out the silk lining inside your front pocket and make it look like a pocket square. And 7 men around me were like, "You can do what?" You shouldn't do that religiously, but you can.
In a pinch.
And especially if the silk inside is like a nice fancy color. The other thing I really loved was in Good Will Hunting, the professor in Good Will Hunting, not Robin Williams, but the lit professor, the math professor, had a scarf that he wore.
I agree. Scarf was after hat. Scarf was next on my list.
Oh my God. I don't know why, but I just really love that. And I know exactly 0 men who do this. So I'm not actually positive that I want to see any of the men I know do that, but I'm open to the possibilities here. Anyway, I think, but the other thing I would note is at the Oscars, a lot of men were wearing men brooches, things in their where they would put a flower. I was impressed by that.
I had considered boutonnieres as an answer here. I just would like the record to reflect.
I told my husband tonight that I have absorbed, I'm at peak news. I'm not allowed to do any more news reading right now. It's just too many things going on, but I'm willing to share a few things that I am aware of, just as much as I'm able to absorb. So one is around the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine. I can't remember what the EM stands for because people only say National Academy of Sciences. So anyway, I started kind of vaguely seeing coworkers lamenting that they were going to cancel the National Academy of Sciences. And I finally gave in to be like, okay, what is this? And apparently, so it's there's been a thing for a while that a number of Republican state attorneys general have been mad that National Academy of Sciences has this climate thing that they have posted online that federal judges use as an evidentiary standard in court. Well, they got mad about it and they said, you guys have to take this down. And the Federal Judicial Center, which is sort of a sort of CRS for judges, that's probably not quite it, but close enough. They did take it down. It's chaired by the Chief Justice. They took it down from their website. The National Academy of Sciences was no, we are not taking that down. So several members of Congress, 10, 11, wrote in to the White House and said, like, hey, we don't like you guys. You should totally like defund like the National Academy of Sciences. And Mark Meadows, who knew he was still relevant, posted about it. And Russ Fout, who is the head of OMB and also quite powerful, he replied to a tweet, as one does on a Sunday, as the head of OMB, and said, on it. So this is important because National Academy of Sciences, like, they do a whole lot of cool stuff. Like, they do some other stuff that you're kind of like, I don't really get this, but they do a lot of cool things. They're an independent nonprofit that gets a tremendous, I think they're congressionally sponsored. I can't remember the terminology. They get a ton of funding in the federal government. They are one of the key sources to produce scientific reference material for courts, policymakers, agencies, and have that be relied on in order to understand what science says. So federal funding is like the bulwark of the work that the funding that they have, and they've already lost a whole lot of it because, as you know, we've had a lot of setbacks in this. So anyway, this is apparently what one does if you're the head of OMB on a Sunday and you just kill science because you can't.
Yeah. Also, I'll just note two other things. The E is for engineering, and in addition to like the public works they do, there's a whole bunch of like governance and infrastructure they provide for the academic establishment. Impact factors, PNAS, which is like a cross-cutting, cross-scientific journal top publication similar to Science or Nature, right? Like, so there's, just to put on my old academic hat, many long lost and forgotten in the hat drawer. It is sort of shocking, in fact, to see. It has never been thought of as political, possibly irrelevant, possibly staid, but never political. And it's hard to think of how it could be political when publishing facts and science.
Here we are. What you're going to talk about, Rada, like, I didn't realize until several hours after the fact and found it incredibly disturbing. So tell us more about what happened in New Jersey.
Yeah. So I was deeply struck by this recent events of protests, and let me cut to the chase, in which a sitting senator from the great state of New Jersey was tear gassed in the face, while all photographic evidence seems to suggest de-escalating a situation. So this happened Memorial Day. It relates to a place called Delaney Hall, which is a privately run 1,000-bed ICE detention facility in Newark that's currently holding around 300 detainees. The detainees are on a hunger strike because of the horrific conditions, which include rotten food, broiling heat, and the withholding of medical care. Senator Andy Kim, who Lauren and I both know from his past life working in the Pentagon, but who's a senator from the state of New Jersey, had been inside Saturday, described a carton of milk with congealed solids, and the reality of a number of the detainees that were arrested at green card interviews. So he had been in the facility. There were ongoing protests about this, and Kim tried to broker a de-escalation to have the agents pull back some of the tactical teams in exchange for the advocates for the protesters allowing inspections of the cars. And the agents, again, according to reports, seem to have fired pepper balls and non-lethal munitions into the crowd. And Andy Kim put himself in between the two, the police and the protesters, and took a face full of spray. Again, there are photographs of this. So I think that's, in some senses, the most striking piece of, a sitting U.S. senator hit with chemical agents by federal law enforcement is shocking in and of itself. But this is like kind of a growing set of escalations here of, there was a mayor arrested last year, Governor Sherrill, who's a governor of New Jersey, was turned away from the facility. And so we're now in a place where basic oversight by elected officials is being treated as, something that is not only obstructionist, but also able to be responded to with lethal or non-lethal force, which is surprising. And underlying that, I just don't want to lose it, is there are like 300 people refusing to eat because of the horrific conditions they're being kept in, conditions that are humanitarian violations. So it is an issue that I felt both on the humanitarian grounds and the like just sheer question of what can oversight look like if not this, which is as an elected official asking the federal enforcement to be allowed admission to a facility. Like that is the bare minimum of enforcement, and if that is responded to with lethal force, we're in a really difficult situation.
It's also like you said this a few times, but I just want to pull this out. The fact that it was on camera, there was clearly people taking photos there. I have no idea whether or not they realized that it was a sitting U.S. senator, but it was clearly like a senior official who was visiting, who was very clearly in photos trying to de-escalate. And I think that's one of the things that always I find most disturbing. Not that anyone in any circumstance ever should be deserved to be like treated in the way that we were talking about, but the visuals and the circumstances are definitely like the ICE folks know. They know exactly what's going to happen. They know that a photo is going to be released, or photos will be released, and it'll be shown that like they went after a senior official who was visiting, who was very clearly doing things to de-escalate. So they either don't care, that's its own level of disturbing, or are jazzed by this, which is even more disturbing. But I'm much closer to thinking the second than I am the former.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think reasonable people can talk about whether there are political stunts and whether, like there's a whole conversation, even if in the worst characterization it is we have political stunts and politicians trying to highlight conditions. The fact that the conditions are political in and of themselves, and the fact that we are responding to that with really, quite unpleasant use of force against nonviolent, all agreed upon nonviolent activity is surprising.
Yeah. Well, what else do we
not as a downer? Well, in the interest of time, I will just note there is a bunch of things that happened that we didn't talk about, but we will think about talking about, and won't commit to talking, but we'll think about talking about in the future, such as the Pope's encyclical on AI and or just war, depending on how you read it. Tulsi Gabbard has departed the pattern, making her not the first cabinet member, and certainly not the first female cabinet member to leave. There's Ebola. That's not great. There are a host of gerrymandering issues going on that go both ways on the politics. Issues that were successful, that courts blocking, Republicans blocking Trump requests. I believe there were some more Iran strikes, but also maybe we're 1 week away from a deal, as we have been for the last month, or 3 months, or 5 months, open question. And there were a host of incumbent primary losses with challengers backed by Trump for Republicans who stood up to Trump, all of which I think that are interesting and newsy and something that is worth thinking about in the future. But for now, I think we move to dumpster fires.
Yeah. With the Tulsi Gabbard departure, there's one thing that we can like put a pin on coming back to at some point in time is, do we actually need an office of the director of the director of national intelligence? Do we need a director of national intelligence? We can come back to that at a future point in time. Well, with dumpster fires, we had picked this topic before the Pope wrote about it. I just want to note that we scooped the Pope, but even though he scooped us, though technically, I was very confused. Like the encyclical is dated to like May 15th, but it just came out. It's like, did you have to like
listen? Get everyone has an interagency process, Lauren.
That's true. That's true.
And we don't have infographics, so
that's also true. We don't have interns, nor do we have like a dicastery or whatever it would be. So it's just us to talk you through stuff that I will turn over to Rada to start on a War Powers resolution.
So, taking a step back, there's this thing called War Powers.
Indeed. Well, I mean, like
there was to be discussed, TBD. Yeah. There was this thing called War Powers, and it has long been talked about in a variety of contexts over the last, frankly, 2 decades, over the course of the war on terror, more recently in the Trump administration. And it seemed like, given the debates and discussions it might be worth taking a moment to talk about what the War Powers Resolution is, what it was intended to do, whether we care about it being used or not, and how we want to think about that in the context of kind of war credibility for military action, both domestically and internationally. So let me start by posing the slightly cheeky question of like, war, what's it good for? / War Powers Resolution. What were we trying to solve? Like, why does it exist? And what's the constitutional theory?
Well, War Powers Resolution passed in the early 70s, 1973, during the Nixon administration. Nixon did not like it. He vetoed it, and Congress was like, nope, nope, we're going to do that anyway. They overruled. It was born out of a whole lot of things, but like in the most recent contextual sense, at that point in time, it was born out of Vietnam, where presidents had been escalating a non-declared war for a while on the basis of a resolution that Congress had passed after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was not exactly entirely kosher, to use the term. And Congress was basically like, hey, it kind of seems as though we have let go our power around declaring war and handed over to presidents who don't seem to actually coming to us and saying like, hey, is it cool? And we've never been able to vote on it. And the Constitution says, hey, everyone, that Congress should be able to declare war. But as it turns out, no one had actually declared a war in the United States, even though it was in 1973, since 1942. Do you know what countries we last declared war against in 42? I was sent
Japan?
No, actually, it was, oh my gosh, it was Bulgaria. I know, Romania, Bulgaria and Romania. So,
sure,
thank you,
as
Bulgaria and Romania for being the last ones we declared war against. So, okay, so here's what it is meant to be. That it is and this is what's kind of bizarre about it. Like, basically, the resolution recognizes that, like, actually, there's moments the president needs to just, like, get some shit done. So it's a 60-day clock. The president can introduce forces into hostilities without Congress saying can do this. He's got 60 days to get Congress to say, okay, cool, we're at war, go do this. Or to say, I just needed to like get my feelings out, go do the thing, and it's done. And the theory was that presidents then can have their emergency flexibility as commander in chief, and like you're able to go either respond to something or proactively deal with something without Congress having to like slow you down. And then Congress then can take back control if the president wants to keep going in some way. So you had what's supposed to happen is like within 48 hours after starting something, the president has to go to Congress and say like, hey, here's what's going on. And here's why in writing I'm legally allowed to do this. So our legal justification. So there's some not entirely solid agreement about whether or not this is okay. There's a constitutional tension underneath this because Article 2, as we talked about, makes president commander-in-chief. Article 1 says Congress, you have the power to declare war. And for most of American history, presidents have interpreted commander-in-chief kind of being like, I get to do what I want, because when I want to declare war, I can. And War Powers Resolution was Congress's attempt to say like, hey, no, actually it has that line for a reason. And we have talked about this. And every president has treated that as a nice advisory line. But in general, they at least try to play nice on paper. Pretty much every president since then has either called it unconstitutional, like outright, or acted as though it's unconstitutional while like kind of playing along. But in the 50 plus years and the years since this has happened, no president has acknowledged that the 60-day clock actually requires them to do something or to stop doing something. They have just like they have played the game without,
yes.
I have to.
I'm just like, it's helpful here maybe to take a second to draw the line between, because if you abstract it away from war, there are two different versions of the executive branch engaging with Congress for congressional. Sometimes it is a notification period where you have to notify Congress and then Congress might come back to you with questions or feedback, but you are not bound by the congressional decision, but you are held up, you're slowed down. There's a little bit of friction in the process for this. And some of them are advisory, like meaningful consultations, which is Congress, may I do this? And then you say yes. And increasingly in War Powers is interesting. There's another whole set of this on like funding authority and budget authority that I'll just slide over for the moment. But traditionally, since Nixon calling it unconstitutional, presidents have treated this as a like a notification rather than a consultation, which is,
Exactly.
hey, Congress.
Yep.
And the theory being that my Article 2 powers, which are critical for the security and defense of our nation, require me to make decisions without slowing down and giving you guys a chance to ask questions. And I get you might have some follow-up questions. So there's within that period, I will give you a chance for follow-up questions. I may not change what I'm doing, but you get to ask your questions. And so my question is, like, even in that construct, which is maybe potentially looser than one might interpret this, has this ever worked? / what does it mean for it to even work?
Yeah. This is an excellent question. And I think that as we are alluding to, both Congress and the president would probably have very, very different views on this. Have presidents stopped military operations because they had to? Usually, very much so, no. But I think, so there's conjecture in this, but I think there's also some like evidence behind it, that I think that like the very fact of war powers and like the being expected to, and often complying with, presenting your argument, has shaped presidents' behavior, as have a number of informal tools around which Congress tries to shape behavior that is not quite use of force, but is related to it. We're related to whether or not you can provide security assistance, related to funding, as you say, where Congress is able to influence and shape behavior by requiring the executive branch to either say publicly that they're doing something or to request funding for something. Those tend to be, I don't want to say more, but interestingly parallel restrictive than in a way than the War Powers Resolution. And I did, like, back in the day, Richard Fontaine and I did a bunch of research on this with Stephen Tankel, and we have shown how, like, yeah, war powers is a thing, but honestly, like, Congress, when it gets its act together, can be super influential in shaping both the start of conflict, but also preventing the start of conflict when it decides to, by having hearings, by having public pressure, by doing codels. When it gets its act together and treats this as a campaign, it can really be like, hey guys, definitely don't, or hey guys, actually, we really want you to go do something, please, 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 which is what it started in Somalia, fascinatingly enough. But then also, presidents also, like, try to shape activity, and I would be curious how your perspective on this is, Rada. They try to shape activity in a way that, like, doesn't trigger war powers in the same way. So, like, not necessarily the start of it, but they will do things in that 60-day period to be like, oh, that wasn't war. That was just, like, hanging out and advising, or maybe we were using drones, but, like, those drones were not, like, real war power stuff. And, like, that has made this squishy in a way, like, the definition of the hostilities, we'll come back to in a minute, has made this squishy in a way that, like, I'm personally very uncomfortable with. All that being said, I think Lebanon, 1983, was a one point in time where Congress invoked it, and Reagan, he didn't exactly comply, but they kind of came to a mutual agreement of, like, oh, you get, like, 18 months of authorized deployment. But that was not exactly it worked, but, like, we have chosen to kind of paper over our disagreement on this. So the Iran stuff was fascinating because you had Chris Murphy and a whole bunch of others trying to tee up a whole lot of energy around this. And you had the Senate actually passing the War Powers Resolution, saying, like, hey, dude, stop. And then the House coming back with that, like, oh, this doesn't count because there was a ceasefire and things have terminated, which was not actually what had happened, because that's not actually how that works. Anyway, that is where we are in this moment of, like, has it worked? Almost certainly not really. Congress has a whole bunch of other powers. It doesn't work in this place.
And I will just, like, couple of notes here, but one, we have mentioned before the authorization of use of military force, AUMF, which was an effort-ish to have Congress reassert its war declaring type powers.
But, like, in a, like, rah kind of way.
Exactly. It was for folks remember, it's post 9/11, right? So it's like, and then it produced 2 decades of administrations of both parties, let the record reflect, basically making up contortions to say that everything they did was justified under that. And then if it wasn't, saying it doesn't count as covered by it because like Libya, right? Where they're like, oh, well, we did some drone strikes, but we're leading from behind and it's not really hostilities and US forces aren't there. And, layering the authorizations until finally at some point, and I think it was Trump 1, where they were just like, yeah, Article 2, boom. We have inherent right to self-defense and we're just going to war and you can't stop us. But I will just note the flip side of that is even now you hear President Trump and the Trump administration not calling this a war, talking about how there's a ceasefire and one-off things for self-defense purposes, right? Even the most recent strikes were covered in that way. So I think despite the fact that it is not really ever been reasonably effective, it has forced this slightly strange narrative that has shaped the way we talk about military activity in the US for a while. And I wonder how much of that is related to the fact that the War Powers Resolution itself is not set up to really create an enforceable structure that might effectively constrain the executive.
Yeah, 100%. Just like the high levels on this is that there are no teeth associated with this. Like presidents might technically comply, but they don't actually have to provide any useful information. And actually, there's tons of reporting projects on this, but they all show that a whole bunch of them that presidents have submitted don't actually show a good legal basis, or they just completely leave it out. And Congress is like, okay. And like, while there's a whole lot of lawfare and just security writings about it, and yes, there are some members of Congress who have been very diligent on this for a long time, it doesn't actually result in anything. And the 68 clock, like, yes, this is nice. It's creating some sort of like public tick for people to pay attention to. It has no automatic enforcement. If the president doesn't withdraw, Congress has to do something rather than like it being automatic. And also the president can veto the resolution that Congress passes, which is hilarious to me. Congress could, if it wanted to, it could cut off funding. But then why would any member of Congress do that? Because immediately they're going to be blamed for like, how dare you not support the troops, which has been happening for a long period of time, and with Iraq being the most egregious example of that. And they do not want to be in that headline of like, no matter how awful and egregious the war is, they do not want to be a headline for saying you don't support the troops, you don't support the war. And we just found that like on top of that, like the thing that was also truly absent where they could have had this, as we said before, there's so much shaping that they can do in that pre-conflict period where we haven't had a hearing on this. We haven't had any conversations around the more detail, the behind the scenes stuff around intelligence, security assistance, basing, like all the stuff where Congress actually could, if it wanted to, put its thumb on the scale. It has in some cases, but it has just really, really absented itself from like the pre-work and then the actual homework. And then they like, hey guys, don't do this piece. And I think they kind of like it that way.
Yeah, I mean, look, the political logic basically runs exactly the wrong way once you have troops involved. As you know, you don't want to be accused of not supporting the troop. You also don't want to authorize and then have some ownership of the conflict if something goes wrong.
Ooh.
And you don't want to fail to authorize and have ownership of not taking military action if something goes wrong. So in some senses, the politics cut to extreme, unserious outrage over the lack of compliance with an unenforceable law while not having any congressional accountability for any of these things.
Yeah.
Sad. So there's that. So, okay, we've got this law that is not well written, but has a at least potential reasonable foundation in trying to bound the unilateral executive choice. So where are there actual reforms that might work? Are there serious proposals? What could be done to make a good war powers resolution?
Yep. People have been talking about various reforms to this for a while for all the reasons that we're talking about. There was a commission by two former secretaries of state, Baker and Christopher, that proposed replacing it with a statute that had a permanent consultation committee. So Rada mentioned earlier the kind of like advisory, like, hey, we're just telling you, versus actually consulting, like you have to talk to us before you do this, having more strength in reporting and requiring votes on all interventions rather than like, we're going to ignore you. there's been, so Senator McCain and also Senators Tin Came have for a long period of time were engaged on reforms around this that didn't make a ton of progress. Sometimes people try to propose an automatic funding cutoff, which would, like, after 60 days, you were no longer, like, funding cannot be used towards any end related to this. So same thing, like, members don't want to be like, oh, well, troops are overseas and I have cut off all their access to food. Like, they don't want to be behind that. There is one that I'm always fascinated by. Like, this creates really interesting bedfellows. Chris Murphy, Bernie Sanders, and Mike Lee, which is like a walked into a bar kind of joke. They like I love this, like the coalition that helps generate this, both like as senators, but also the bipartisan, cross-partisan coalition that helped generate this. It's like hugely varied. They have wanted to push something that has war powers reform, arm export reform, and then national emergencies reform that would beef up consultation and congressional authorization powers. It would have automatic sunsets of any authorization. It would have funding cutoffs. It actually, the thing that was really important to me is that it defines hostilities, which there's so much of what the United States does right now that like is like extremely clearly war, that we're like, oh no, we're just like dancing about in the daisies and we just happen to have guns with us. Chris Murphy has been on this case for ages, and he has been the one who's been forcing floor votes on Iran for a long time now. In part, I mean, it's show, but also he's trying to build a record to show that, like, even though he's losing the votes, this creates a ton of political pressure, particularly that they haven't had any freaking hearings on this, which is crazy.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about those, because those are symbolic. They're obviously symbolic votes, and they're doing them in the Senate. But like, in some senses, they, in addition to creating this administrative record, create some accountability for at least some parts of the establishment in Congress voting for this. So how should we think about these types of votes? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, can you imagine Congress this week? Like, they're on recess, they're going back. Gas prices are up, grocery prices are up, and some of them are having to defend, like, no, I'm cool with this war. This seems to be going great right now. So you had this vote in the Senate before recess. Didn't go anywhere in the House. It went 50-47, which is notable. A bipartisan rebuke with Republicans included Bill Cassidy. Cassidy said he wouldn't authorize an extension until the administration could provide clarity, nice word, on what it was actually doing, which is a fair question that we would all like to know at this point in time. The administration, God, I can totally feel the lawyers doing this. They said, this is the analogy I came up with like 3 days ago. This is illegally creative in a way that a 3-year-old is creative when he says they ate their vegetables because some fell on the floor. There was a May 1st letter to Congress to argue that the war powers resolution clock had been satisfied because there was an April 7th ceasefire that terminated hostilities, even though U.S. forces had engaged in hostilities after that date. Like, so, like, hey guys, it doesn't count because we stopped for a minute. Anyway, so there's the political logic, as we talked about before. This runs totally the wrong way because people don't want to do the voting against the troops. Demanding authorization means that people get blamed there, and all of that means that the president has a tremendous amount of power in terms of the information environment, in terms of controlling force, in terms of like bully pulpit, but also in the fact that he knows that members of Congress are completely cowed on this. And while this vote had some power in the Senate, people were pretty confident that the House was not going to be able to make it happen either.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in the end, some of this just begs the broader question of how we think about, I don't know, the legitimacy of war, what makes a war legitimate or not legitimate, right? Like, some of the constitutional underpinnings of that is that you didn't want a despot or a tyrant unilaterally declaring war for, quixotic reasons, I'll call it.
Yes, what the founders were super worried about, at least we see they are, of like, they want people's representatives to be able to have to bear that political cost of sending people to die. And when that accountability disappears, you get despots who can just commit the country to do whatever they want without any skin in the game. And then Congress right now is in the place of having to criticize from the sidelines. I think that like, so this is actually one of the things, like just before we close, like we talked briefly about the Pope's encyclical. I think this is a fascinating intervention that is all happening literally at the same time.
Yeah.
Where the United States is absenting itself from having any legitimate authority to declare war. Like nobody is saying we're at war. There's not an official declaration. There's not congressional authorization. There's not a party that is like saying, here's why we're doing this. And that is a key part of what the Catholic Church has a long time called just war theory. And like the fact that like the United States is just so weakening this at this moment in such an obvious way, at the same time the Pope has come out and said that the just war theory is outdated because it had been used to abuse any kind of war and justify it, I think is an interesting moment to be happening all at one time.
Yeah, I mean, just to close us out on this, I think, and I was just talking to Lauren before we were recording this on like doing a deeper dive on this, but I think the encyclical's critique on just war theory is almost the same critique on the War Powers Resolution, which is it's this sort of ex post rationalization that I wanted to start a war and now I'm going to work backwards through this set of criteria to justify it, rather than treating peace and dialogue as an end and a goal in and of itself, and this sort of war making and war execution as a last resort. And I think there's an interesting conversation on what is the secular version of this, right? Because it's clear the encyclical and just war theory, what is appealing about it is it's not saying all wars are bad, right? It is recognizing the reality of human existence, but it applies this notion of that is where you ended up is a failure in and of itself. And there are key incidents, this sort of pre-conflict oversight machinery that Lauren, you were talking about in your work with Richard and Stephen Dankel kind of goes to this on like this pre-war machinery that forces the friction to avoid that failure. And when you don't even make an effort at that, it does feel like something has really fallen to the wayside.
Yeah, I loved how like he calls so directly out that like, we have all these qualifiers to what just war theory is supposed to be. We've talked about legit authority. You have to have just cause. You have to have a right intention. This would be a last resort, proportionality, blah, blah, blah. And he just very directly says like, you guys have abused this shit. Like these were supposed to be the ways that we prevented dictators from just using force however they wanted. And instead, you either roll over it or you lie about everything in a way that doesn't make any sense right now. And oh, by the way, you have better tools. We don't have to assume that war is a human condition. We should assume that forgiveness and diplomacy and engagement are possibilities here too. And he has a line, I'll use my last line here. I just love this. The use of force, violence, and weapons reflects a relational poverty. What great relational poverty.
Yeah.
That always has disastrous consequences for civilian populations. So anyway, #Pope.
Yeah, who knew we were going to be so Pope forward in this podcast, but here we are.
So we will move on to a new topic now and talking about crisis engineering. This week for Warning Signs, we are excited to have a guest who I have been following, working in the same circles with, being fangirling around for several years now. Marina Nitze has been in some incredibly consequential government technology roles and also government technology disasters. We'll talk a little bit about that in the last 20 years. She did not cause the disaster. She was usually the one trying to help solve. Her job was to help fix them. She has served in a lot of awesome places between the CTO at the Department of Veterans Affairs. She was one of the folks who helped put together the U.S. Digital Service. She is done a lot of work on the outside of government as well, working in what is called crisis engineering, that we'll talk more about in a little bit, that embeds directly inside organizations when things are actively, whether literally or figuratively, on fire, depends. She has a last book. Her last book, which I love very much, Hack Your Bureaucracy, was required reading certainly for me before I went back into government during the Biden administration, and for a lot of folks who've really tried to get things done inside government. She has a new book, Crisis Engineering, which is co-authored with other folks in this universe, Matthew Weaver, and Mikey Dickerson, about why complex systems fail, why normal, change management processes don't often work, and why sometimes a crisis can be sometimes a gift if you know what you're doing and actually make it your best shots to have some transformative change. So, Marina, welcome to Sirens. We're so delighted to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a huge fan.
So I'm going to start with go in the way back times, which this seems almost like sort of quaint at this point in time, and thinking about how one can use crisis as a window, thinking about healthcare.gov. You were in government at the time when healthcare.gov was launched and then went very quickly down slope. And you, I think, perhaps uniquely amongst a few people, both saw up close and through colleagues what was going on, but also had moments of realizing how this might be a window into a new way of doing business. Talk us through that story.
Yeah, so healthcare.gov was supposed to launch on October 1st, which longtime viewers may also remember was the first day of the government shutdown. So there were not a lot of people around. I was the CTO of the VA, which ostensibly had nothing to do with healthcare.gov. But when it was failing to load on October 1st, somebody was like, hey, Marina knows how computers work. Could we borrow you? So I drove out on October 1st. And at that point, it was not yet a useful crisis. It was shocking to me, although I now kind of can unpack why. I brought my toothbrush. I was expecting to be sleeping on the floor, very little, trying to help get it back up. And when I went there was almost nobody in the office. And the process for responding to this outage was a standard daily phone call on the big conference phone call machine. And that was it. And everybody they were like, yep, not working. They signed off. And I was like, whoa, this is not, do you have a system diagram or anything? Could we help? And they were like, it's fine. You can go home tonight. It wasn't really a crisis in the sense of being a useful opportunity to make huge change for weeks later. And that's where my co-authors, Mikey Dickerson, came into government. And that it was sort of a slow boil relative to the consequences of what was happening when people were unable to enroll in healthcare, and also the potential consequences to the Affordable Care Act overall, right? But it was weeks before the visibility and the clarity to the people on the ground that trying what they're usually was doing, the daily stand-up, looking at the architecture meeting, demanding status updates across 55 contractors, that was not going to work. And it was that realization that opened up the door to say, whoa, we have to do something different if we're going to succeed here. Let's bring in these technologists like my colleague Mikey, who ended up running the healthcare.gov rescue for that first year. We have to do procurement super fast. We have to figure out how to hire experts in minutes, which those of you who are familiar with government know is totally insane. And then things like we have to have monitoring, which up until that point, the government had viewed as a scary outside security risk if you were going to put monitoring on your IT system. And out of healthcare.gov, not to say that it's perfect everywhere, but now it's a fairly routine ask. And that's one of those transformational things that the collapse allowed to have happen.
So I love your description that you just made of how, even though in retrospect, healthcare.gov and the time that you showed up with your toothbrush was obviously a crisis in terms of what it should have been perceived as, but was not operationalized as a crisis and also wasn't that opportunity. One of the things that you talk about is how do you know that you're in a crisis? And actually, how do you know you're in a crisis that you can do something about? Which, as somebody who's worked in the national security field, I'm curious what you thought, Rada. I was found fascinating. It's oh wow, I've never thought about it this way before. How tell us more about that diagnostic and how can you actually use it in practice? Particularly amongst organizations that may or may not truly recognize they're in that moment.
Yeah, so we have 5 indicators of crisis that we lay out in the book, and I'll explain them. But I will say that getting to that point, we all spent years and years of abject confusion where there would be moments like that first day of healthcare.gov where I have my toothbrush and nobody else is doing anything differently. At the VA, I experienced this as an almost out-of-body experience every single day where you'd be there's a 7-year backlog for appeals, or we think it's going to take 4.5 years to work down this disability claims backlog. It's a crisis, guys, right? And nobody would do anything different. And it's not because they were bad people. That would have been actually infinitely easier to work with. If there was an evil guy on the 12th floor, we could have just taken turns locking him in his office or distracting him or something. But it said it was entirely about how the organization was built and that. But then we would see moments like healthcare.gov, where then I got the experience of working on the VA healthcare claims backlog, which seemed at first to be like yet another claims backlog at the VA, but ultimately was this opportunity for super rapid transformational change. And so we ended up looking at these, like, why are there moments when the government or other large organizations can make huge rapid change sometimes and then not others? And it turns out there's a bunch of research in this over history that most people have lost track of, because most of these books you have to get for like $300 from a used bookstore, and there's one of them. And so the 5 indicators of crisis to us, and it might help the listener to think of it as a crisis you can do something huge very quickly about. The first one is fundamental surprise. So you didn't see it coming. The second is that you have a core breakdown in your ability to do your core function. So you cannot process disability claims anymore, or you can process 0.5% of unemployment claims in 10 times as long. So maybe you can get like a few out, but fundamentally you are failing to do the thing that you are designed to do. The third one is high visibility. In our world, like the president is asking about it. You are getting called into a cabinet meeting. That you are in the case of healthcare.gov, you're on CNN every day where people are refreshing the website and seeing if it works. The fourth one is a rigid deadline. The example we give a lot here is a Taylor Swift concert. So like Ticketmaster, which has definitely had huge crisis outages before. The Taylor Swift concert is not going to wait 5 weeks for them to figure it out. You have to sell the tickets. Government actually has much more flexible deadlines than we had realized until we started researching this. Like the IRS moves tax day more often than it doesn't move tax day. So that is only so useful as a rigid deadline. But then the final piece is a breakdown in sense making. And this to me is like the core thing that made the world make sense to me when it did not make sense before. And sense making is a term coined by sociologist Carl Weick in the 1960s. But if you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman and systems 1 and 2 thinking, it's your system 1 thinking. It's our brain subconsciously constantly constructing a story of our reality and our sense of identity in that reality. Our brains do it all the time. You can't really control it, although it's helpful to know that you're doing it. And our brains prefer system 1 thinking. We move around the cabin, mostly automatically. But when we are suddenly, our sense of reality has broken enough from actual reality, we kick into that system 2 thinking, which is slow and painful. And a simple example to understand here is if you go to a foreign country and suddenly you don't know how to pay, how to turn on the light switch, how to work the washing machine, you have suddenly things like getting breakfast or getting on the bus require you to stop and slowly process in a way that you would not if you're just, in DC that morning hopping on the train. And so this breakdown in sense making is, I'm a claims processor. My job is to process disability claims, and I cannot do that now. My sense is broken down, and that is the magical part of a crisis and why it's an opportunity for change, because everything is a complex system these days. A complex system is any system that's made of computers and people. The computer part, some government paperwork aside, is relatively easy to change. The human part is very, very, very hard to change. And the window that people are most willing to change is when they have this cognitive dissonance where their sense of identity, their sense making has broken down. And so that's why a crisis is a fairly magical, if you know how to use it, window of 24, 48, 72 hours where you can suddenly get people to behave wildly differently and get that new behavior to stick in a crisis window.
And let me, I love this frame because to Lauren's point, I think, especially in large bureaucracies, I'll use the Pentagon as my sort of anchor example. It is hard to get changes in habit outside of things. But I guess, we have seen changes where that happens, right? And so you had I'll use acquisition reform. You had nothing for really a long time. Now you have a sudden spike in things that one could have called a crisis and was often called a crisis over and over again until all of a sudden there were big changes. Flip side is you sometimes see big changes and then sort of reversion back. So maybe the question is, devil's advocate, is a crisis that you take advantage of just something you call a crisis in retrospect? Or is there some clear, is that the only way to drive change? Or is there some sort of clear set of properties that whether it's a crisis or not, can result in big transformations.
Yeah. So I am a believer that you can make change almost anywhere to some degree. And my last book, Hack Your Bureaucracy, was literally a compilation of people that made pretty impressive changes around a lot of government stories, but also some non-government stories too, because bureaucracies, for better or worse, are not just governments.
Oh, I know.
Yes. And, but, in bureaucracy hacking, having done a lot of it in some of the, I think at this point, all of the biggest bureaucracies in the world, you hit points where you cannot make change. Or you can make incremental change and you see the path and it's going to be 4 or 5 years of slow incremental progress. Still possible, still often worth doing. But the crisis is the window where you might be able to make that huge change very quickly. Depending on what the change is that you want to make. And I get this question a lot too. Like, I am a backlog solver at heart. There's nothing I like more than solving a backlog or automating a process so that it's serving that end user. If it's someone getting unemployment benefits, definitely if it's a veteran, right, getting that benefit way faster in a much more sensible way. And to redesign a process like that from start to finish is possible through bureaucracy hacking to some extent, but requires years and years and years of effort and like precise work and a lot of slamming your head against a steel wall, frankly. But if that's the vision you've got in your back pocket, and then that crisis comes along, you might be able to get 80, 90% of the way there to that desired future that you have in literally a matter of days. I've seen it happen. And that's the difference when you have these indicators and you have this useful crisis, and that not all the indicators have to be there, but most of them do. And the breakdown in sense making definitely has to be there, because that's, again, that cognitive dissonance that you want to take advantage of. For better or worse, I do want to say, like, you can definitely use this for evil, but everybody listening to this is going to use it for good, where you can suddenly do that human change very, very quickly and make it stick.
You mentioned having the reform ready to go. And I had a deputy, I say a deputy, he's incredible. He was much more, I effectively worked for him, even though he technically worked for me. His name was Dustin, and we had a joke about him having a Dustin
Brown?
Yeah, Dustin Brown.
Oh my God, he was my first bureaucracy hacking help on the civil service reform. I love him.
Yeah, so we talked about him having like the Dustin just outdoor, like he like things he was just waiting for the right moment for somebody to say like this is time to be able to do it. But I mean, it's not that there's many people who are like Dustin in the world, but I do think sometimes it's hard to create space, particularly as a civil servant, to do that homework, to have those reforms ready to go. So I would there's probably not like a way to do this, but if you have some insights or advice on like how that kind of homework is generated, whether from inside the system or out, or the ways to actually have it ready to go, would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, outside of a crisis circumstance, I think the best way to go about it is to be working towards that North Star and really know the details of what would need to change. And like Dustin was a magician at this. People look at the creation of the U.S. Digital Service, and it's very easy to say like, oh, healthcare.gov happened, and the federal government realized that it needed more technologists inside it. And so it worked with OPM to make a pilot and then like created this USDS. That is not what happened. People have been working on the problem of, can we do a pilot to get technologists into government since at least China Lake in 1979. And years before healthcare.gov, there had been GovX and all these other ideas for bringing technologies to government. And I came into government through the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program, which was a pre-effort to get 18 of us into government. And so this is, I think, an example where people were trying for a very long time, absent a crisis. But they had all the pieces. They knew what the hiring authorities were going to be. They knew what it would look like. And then when the healthcare.gov happened, it opened this window where OPM was with still some significant amount of needing to be pulled along, able to make space for this. So I think wherever you are in the bureaucracy, it is worth working towards what that North Star is and knowing in detail what it looks like. You very well likely may be able to do parts of it absent a crisis. But in the crisis, my favorite quote is Milton Friedman's, "Whatever is implemented in a crisis is whatever's laying around." I have seen that happen, and I'm sure you have too. And sometimes the thing that's laying around is not good. I have definitely seen like OMB, something get in the Federal Register one day because there was a hackathon at the White House and somebody had a thing in their drawer. And they were like, we need an announcement. And then that announcement became the thing. And I really tried to learn from that and be like, ooh, what announcement can I have in my drawer ready to go? Because sometimes like something that is really not ready for prime time will get pushed all the way through in that moment.
Rada, I'm thinking of like the Pentagon equivalent. There's so many Pentagon equivalents of this, but like one of them is whatever's laying on a crisis gets implemented. And that is quite often utilization of the United States Marine Corps. Yeah. Because they are just laying around in a crisis. And here you go. And
I mean, I do think this is how we end up using the military for things it is just not designed at all to use for. But I also think, and maybe I'll just turn us to a topic near and dear to my heart, which is AI in these complex bureaucratic situations. Because I think, you note this, that there's a lot of money and organizational, I will say, energy being put into these AI into production systems at speed and scale under the theory that this is going to change all the things and transform all the stuff. And, on the one hand, maybe this is crisis engineering and people are taking advantage of this to bring technology in. On the other hand, feels like maybe there are some checks and controls we might want to put in as we integrate. So as we look forward to what the future landscape and in these complex government system looks like, what does responsible AI integration actually look like? And maybe even to broaden it out a little bit, what does responsible integration of this type of new, potentially game-changing technology look like? And how do you know if you're doing it wrong?
Yeah. I have two answers to that. The first one is I've been obsessed for the last 2 weeks thinking about Jen Paulka's blog post on eating policy about the 3 horizons of government reform.
Oh my God, Marina, this has been my life for the last month, but yes.
Yes. Well, then I don't know if everybody's familiar with it, but I won't try to oversummarize it. But basically, like the third horizon, H3, is where we want to go. That's our North Star of like how we want the government to work. And then there's 2 kinds of H2s. The H2 negative is we're just like we're covering over or making it like, okay, we're doing
the Band-Aid.
With the Band-Aid, and we're gonna Band-Aid over it. And then an H2 positive is this is a fundamental reform we're making that's making some fundamental change towards that H3 future that we want to live in. I am sometimes jealous of the speed at which AI is being adopted and making it through like procurements and IT approval paperworks in a way that like some much safer technology did not when I was in government. But I'm really sad to see that almost all the applications of AI are H2 negative. They are like, we're going to take this Byzantine application for SNAP or for housing benefits, and we're going to paper over it with AI. And the thing that has been keeping me up at night is, are we actually forestalling a crisis by doing that in a way that is ultimately going to cause a lot more harm because we never fixed the core thing that was broken? So that is what's keeping me up at night. Another part of AI I think we're not talking about enough in the public sector, or maybe the whole space, is there's going to be a whole bunch of AI-generated crises that are around the corner. I mean, the ability to take down a call center before of any kind, unemployment call center, a VA call center, any a 211 call center, was there, but pretty limited. And now, I mean, it is, I think, a matter of weeks to months before we're at a point where there's going to be government services that absolutely collapse under the weight of AI. Somebody that is like, even if not actively malicious, bored. And then in a pandemic or in an unemployment moment, you just might have enough people that have Claude deploying on their behalf that are seeking help and are desperate. But that level of desperation from one person hitting redial versus what they can do with AI is going to take down the whole ship. This would be a good moment to know what you want your benefits program to look like in a future where AI has taken it down.
So I think this is like such a big and important question, because a core part of government and often bureaucratic functioning is sort of the average, like the predictability and what I'll call like the mean expectation of it functioning and doing things. And AI doesn't just increases the particular chance that a bad thing might happen, but I like to say second moments matter. And if you're a data person, that will tell you that I'm talking about variance, but it creates volatility in systems that fundamentally their value proposition is predictability. And things like customer support call centers, things like access to benefits that are have all of these rigid and often Byzantine rules. And the one benefit of that is there is some predictability in what this Byzantine old process looks like. And I similarly spend a lot of time worrying that this lift and shift creates fragility in a process that already was problematic without getting the full benefits of streamlining with AI, where if you were like, what's the purpose of what it is we're trying to do here? How does technology fit into that? And like, what do we need to do? So I think some of this like question of not just transformation, but like the human machine system itself is like entirely missing from the conversation. And maybe we'll have the opportunity to test your crisis engineering over and over and over again because
of AI.
Silver lining.
Yeah. I'm sorry to say, but like, yes, that's what I expect to be happening. But that's why, I'm not a Pollyanna, but we can look at the crisis as something like absolutely awful that we have to grin and bear through. Or we can fully take advantage of it so that we can reduce the harm and actually like not just during that crisis, but going forward. And so I have been obsessively thinking about like, how much are we doing H2 negatives where we're just prolonging what may be inevitable and prolonging a lot of pain. I mean, we are currently in a country where half of the people want the government to burn down. There's a reason for that. A lot of it is because it has extremely sucked at doing just about everything, and it is not outcomes driven. Having outcomes tied to like a procurement or a system is not rocket science or crazy, but it is not how the government works right now. Is there a way that next crisis can be used to shift it and say like, hey, we're going to have people accountable to this, and we are all going to march towards an outcome of like, this benefit is delivered to 90% of people in this amount of time, and that's the outcome. We're going to measure it, and that's the goal, not that we met 3,700 pages of compliance requirements. Which everything on healthcare.gov was green.
Yeah. It was ready to go.
Launch. Everything was green and nothing was green, but everything was green. There's a concept in the book Inside Bureaucracy by Anthony Downs that I love, which is rear view metrics. And I think constantly, I read it after government, and I'm sad that I did because I wish I had read it earlier. But I mean, so much of what we did was running on rear view metrics, and you'd have 17 layers of people that made slide decks and like reported and massaged information, et cetera. Like what you should actually be looking at is real time. Is the website up? Can you log into it? Yes or no? Forget the 55 people that reported green on their spreadsheet.
I love that concept, rear view metrics. Another one I learned the other day was folk law. FOLK.
Oh, I love
like
that.
Imaginary law. I was like, that's perfect. There's so much folk law that I had to deal with all the time.
Yes, that's great. We called it water cooler rules, but I'm going to switch to folk law immediately.
Yeah, I love this. I used to like wander around being like, show me the law.
Yeah.
Yes.
The law. Which could be a valuable use of AI in the future. One final question before we close out. So there's a ton of people, myself included, but like there's lots of people in the universe who are thinking about there will be new leaders coming into new administrations at some point in time. Whatever your political persuasions, like there will be new people who are arriving. Yeah. And I think one of the things I've loved about reading your work is given this insider's view, a very, very different angle on how you should think about managing these systems, these complex systems that we work in government. If you could tell them like one piece of homework to do before they show up early, like what is the thing that they should try to learn about the office, the system, or whatever it is that they're going to be in charge of?
You need to understand in depth how the process, whatever the top one or two priorities are that you are over as a leader, how that works. And I mean, I sort of joke, I get paid a lot of money these days as a crisis engineer to follow, an application or a bug from start to finish, and generally discover that nobody else has ever done that before, but it is not rocket science. And there's this strange like cultural belief that is beneath a leader. But I will say I was an SES, and I spent half of my time not in DC at VACO headquarters, but out in the field watching claims be processed, meeting people in the field. And that is what fundamentally helped me do everything, was understanding the nuances of how it worked. And I was very lucky. I had really incredible leaders at the VA. But I definitely get a sense broadly that people are like, oh, SES, I manage people, and that's fancy. And it's not fancy to go out and follow a claims process from start to finish. But that is the best possible thing you could possibly do, is really deeply understand, because these processes are never designed from start to finish. They are accumulations of archaeological cruft of policy. And as we are in 2026, there's just more and more of it. Nobody's ever removing it. And so understanding how the process works will give you unbelievable powers and insight into how to make it better, because there's simply nobody over it besides you as the leader from how it works from start to finish. And everybody is generally doing their best. They are following policy and procedure, et cetera. But that is often leading to an outcome that nobody likes.
My version of this is I love that idea. And I think there's been some leaders who get that intuitively and others who, as you say, that like they feel as though like, why is that my role? I would love to be able to see a version of undercover government that does this. So it's not just the front end of I am mysteriously applying for whatever this benefit is and kind of waiting and watching through the system. But then you see the other side too, and you're following along the little dot, like, where is this going? Why does it go through the same kind of route 32 times? Why is it we are checking for an eligibility thing that they clearly have and the government actually already knows? Any number of different things. I love this idea.
Like how a bill becomes a law. It's like how a bill becomes a law, but like how a claim becomes a benefit.
Please, somebody update Schoolhouse Rock to explain how it actually works.
Is what we need.
Marina, this has been an awesome conversation. I'm both hopeful that there is a crisis and isn't a crisis that you continue to help be valuable in, like how to have both hopes at one time. People should definitely check out both books, Hack Your Bureaucracy and Crisis Engineering. And with that, we're going to turn over to Gong Show. All right, so for the Gong Show, we are moving closer to the end of the school year and summer and so on. And I know we all have various vacations planned out. So I wanted to ask about the most resentfully ridiculous teenagery vacation that you have ever been dragged on before. And to be fair, I think Radha and I were probably both extremely well-behaved and very nice children. So like we were probably not that ridiculous. However, I'm sure that there were moments that we are not necessarily proud of in our vacation-y existence. So Radha, do you have a particular one?
Yeah, I have two, and they both sound ridiculous when I'm going to say them out loud here, which is they were awesome vacations and my parents were great. And I was just, I am the asshole in these stories. And the first was going to the Olympics in Atlanta.
Oh my God.
My parents got lottery tickets to.
Yeah.
Like they won this lottery and I was like, I don't want to go. And like now all my friends are at camp and like, I'm going to miss all this. Yeah.
It's the Olympics.
I know. Again, I told you I'm the asshole.
Yeah.
And the second was when I was in high school, my parents had me for 5 weeks. We traveled around India and I got to like see all these different sites and they set up all these tours. And I was just like, but like, I want to do like sports things before and I'm going to miss out on all of the summer planning. And now I'm like, will my parents pay for me to go for 5 weeks to travel around India now? Because I would be very appreciative. You watch my children. I will leave for 5 weeks. And so no, they were awesome, 2 awesome vacations. And I was just the asshole about it.
Yeah. This summer I am doing this to my son. I'm going on a vacation to the Grand Canyon, Bryce Canyon, and Zion Canyon when I was like 13, 14. My parents took my sister and I on the same vacation where we drove from Texas all around the Southwest, California, Yosemite, went back again. And my parents were like, you and your sister were such total bitches. Like, we'd be like, hey, look outside of this gorgeous scenery. And when you'd be like, meh. I definitely, to be fair, as I'm now in my 40s, I remember this vacation quite fondly. Like, we got to saw a bunch of cool stuff. It was beautiful. It was gorgeous. I very much remember getting to read the Babysitters Club super special where they went to summer camp, and I really treasured that. That was great. I'm really happy that I could read that Babysitters Club book. And I'm sorry that I was like a total jerk. The other thing I remember at the vacation was, we camped out, we stayed in cabins, stayed in hotels, stuff like that. This one place that we went to, we stopped at the grocery store, and for some reason they only had turkey hot dogs, which at that time in the 90s was not a normal thing to find, and ketchup with no salt. So we were like, what is this terrible, terrible world that we're in of turkey hot dogs and ketchup with no salt? So hopefully Wyatt, my son, will be treated to at least ketchup and salt when we're in the Grand Canyon this summer.
One can only hope.
One can only hope. All right. Well, thank you for listening to this glorious episode of Sirens. Please say nice things about us on the internet to your friends, and we'll see you next time.